the Banzhaf power distribution is the first method of determining the power levels for each of the players within a weighted voting system. And it's the first of the methods we're going to learn. We're also going to learn a second method next week when we start 2.3 and wrap up with 2.4. So let's get into how it actually works and where it begins. But basically, step one is to calculate all of the winning coalitions, as I talked about a couple videos ago. But from those, because when we find all of the winning coalitions, basically we're looking at what are all of the potential ways that the players can come together to actually pass the motion. Basically, kind of seeing who's contributing uh, to making the quota actually be passed. But instead of just counting up all the times people are involved in winning coalitions, we want to think about who is actually relevant and who is actually important to those winning coalitions. And that's where the term critical player comes into play. So the term critical player, it's well, you can look at how the book defines it, but how I've defined it here in the slides is a player within a winning coalition whose vote is necessary for that coalition to make it to the quota. So in other words, if we have some winning coalitions, some of those players might be important and some of them might not be important. And the criticality of those players will help us determine who is actually influential and who is important to the various different groups in a weighted voting power system. So let's look at an example. And basically, to start off with the Banzhaf power distribution, we need to know all of the winning coalitions, but then once we find them all, we want to figure out the critical player. And what the book recommends to do is to underline them in your coalitions as you're listing them, and that will help us to figure out who is critical and who is not critical. But like for example, let's take this situation right here. Let's say that we have voters with weight 4, 3, 2, and 1, and let's say the quota is set to be 6. And if we look at that, that's would be a simple majority of the total vote. Let's say we're taking into account the coalition of players 1, 3, and 4 with votes 4, 2, and 1 respectively. If we're trying to figure out, well, who to this group is actually important and who is critical, as as the term indicates, player one's vote is quite critical to this group, right? Because and how I like to do it is I imagine removing them from the coalition and thinking about, does that change whether they're winning or losing, right? Because initially they have a total weight of 7, enough to make it to the quota. But if player one were to be removed, they for sure would not be able to make it to the quota with just players 3 and 4, because that would be only 3 votes. So by definition, player 1 is critical because their vote is needed to make it to the quota. That 4 votes is critical. And undoing that, we could do the same thing with each player to determine the criticality of each. So for example, looking at player 3 in that group, if their vote was removed, we'd be left with players 1 and 4 with a total weight 5. Now notice that that would also be a losing coalition because 4 and 1 would only, would not make it to 6. So basically player with 2 votes is also critical because those 2 votes were really important to make it to that quota, right? If they're gone, they're not going to win. But thinking about the third player, if I was to remove them instead, that would leave us with a total of 6 votes from players 1 and 3. But notice that doesn't actually change the outcome because originally the weight was 7, enough to make the quota. Without the 1, it doesn't make any difference. So what we can see is that player 4 there with 1 vote is not really critical to that particular coalition. Now that doesn't mean they might not be critical to other coalitions, but in this specific instance, if we're kind of imagining this as a group of 3 friends all kind of voting the same way, really the 4 and the 2 are what make it to that quota of 6. The 1 didn't really play meaningfully with the group, and whether player 1 said yes or no made no difference, which is why that player was not contributing to the power, and they really had no power in that context. So basically, the players that are underlined get what we call critical points to their critical power, their Banzhaf power index, and the players that are not critical don't get any power. And basically, if we do the same process to every coalition in a system, we can finish calculating the Banzhaf power distribution. And this is an excerpt from the book, which describes the process of finding the Banzhaf power distribution. And basically, it's enumerating exactly what I've been saying. Let's just take a peek at this for a minute. It says, step 1, make a list of all winning coalitions. And we've did that before, but basically we want to find all the different ways the players can come together to make it to the quota. Step 2, within each winning coalition, determine which are the critical players. It is a good idea to underline them to note who is critical and who is not. And so this is kind of a tricky part of the process. First of all, we got to make sure we find all of them. It's if some are missing, it's not going to be a proper calculation because we're not really taking every option into account. And then finding the critical players will help us to determine who is actually influential in those winning groups, therefore letting us figure out who is meaningfully powerful. Then what we want to do is tally up all the critical counts, which is basically, well, how many times was each player underlined? How many times were they important? And whoever is important more often, right, has more power. And so the book used B sub 1, B sub 2, B sub 3, and so on to stand for the critical counts for each specific player. Uh, and B is for Banzhaf, if you're wondering why they chose B there. It says to then find the total critical count, which is the sum of all the individual critical counts, and then find the Banzhaf power indices by taking the ratio of each individual to the total. And we'll do an example of this here in just a second. So if there's too many steps and it's hard to keep track of everything, I think it'll make more sense once we actually do an example in terms of what are we doing and why do we do these steps. But essentially, we want to know how many times is each player critical out of the total number of total critical count, and then we can determine how influential each player is by taking the ratio of their part to the total. And that will give us like a percentage of how meaningful were they out of all of the meaningful players. And that is the final answer, the percentage power that they have, which we just call their Banzhaf power index. And the entire system is called the Banzhaf power distribution. It's kind of the distribution of power within that system. So let's go back to the packet and let's do an example, because again, it's kind of hard to really understand all of these individual steps without looking at the bigger picture. So let's move to the next page. And let's start off by practicing finding the critical player in a few of these problems. And just to remind you, a critical player is a player whose vote is needed to maintain the winning status of the coalition. So let's start with this new fresh example where we have 4 players with votes 13, 9, 5, and 2, where the quota is set to be 15. And it says find and underline the critical players in each of these scenarios. So before we actually get to practicing the Banzhaf power distribution, let's just do a little bit of practice finding the critical players. And before I go over it, hit pause, try it yourself, see if it's making sense, and then you can compare your answers with what I get. But how I actually like to write the coalitions is using the numbers rather than the player numbers. So player 1 had 13 votes, and player 4 had 2 votes. And this is just sort of a different way of writing it, which I think is easier for determining the criticality of each player. And so this is a winning coalition because the weight is 15 and they have enough to make the quota, which is also 15. But in this case, if I was trying to figure out who's critical, what I like to do is think about it one person at a time. So if I'm thinking about the first player, I would think about, well, what if they were gone? Would they still win without him? Clearly no, because and generally when you're thinking about 2-player coalitions, both players are typically critical because no one person should be able to win by themselves. That would be a dictatorship. So in this case, well, the 13 votes was really necessary to uphold the winning status, but so was the 2, right? Even though they're different number of votes, they're equally important to that specific group to making it to 15. And in the same way, I could think about if two is gone, will they make it without him or her? And that's obviously no, they're not going to make it to 15, just with one person. So, and this is a general theme. In smaller coalitions, usually more of the players are critical. In larger ones, usually less, because when there's more people, it's less likely that each one individually is actually relevant. Whereas with smaller groups, it's more likely for everyone to be important, or at least some of them. Let's look at another example between players 2, 3, 4. So that would be weights 9, 5, and 2. In this case, again, what I like to do is think about one player at a time. If I was to remove player 1, they're not going to have enough votes. And basically, if you're thinking about math here, remove the player, add up the rest. If it's short, that player is critical. So that's definitely not going to make the quota. Player 1 is critical. Player 2, also critical. 9 and 2 does not make 15. And player 3, this one is close. 9 and 5 also does not make 15. But imagine if that was if they had 3 votes, then they Actually, still they still be critical, but you could imagine that each of these specific numbers can make a difference, and there's no general pattern here. You really have to analyze each person separately to really know if they're critical or not. But anyways, in this case, all three players are critical once again, because if any one of them is gone, they're going to lose their uh, winning status. Another thing you can do that's kind of helpful is just calculate the total weight of the coalition and think about if you subtract their weight from the total weight, if it would fall below the quota, they're critical. If it would not fall below the quota, they are not critical. And there's probably one too many knots in that sentence, so this is a little bit of a tricky idea to explain because of the nature of the term. But hopefully you can, if you get the idea, I think it's a little easier in terms of are they really important or not. Now, looking at players 3 and 4, that coalition is not a winning coalition, right? Because they don't even make it to the quota. So in a non-winning coalition, none of those players are critical because they're not going to pass the motion anyway. So that's why in the Banzhaf power distribution, we only care about winning coalitions because losing coalitions will never have anyone important. And then let's say we were looking at the example with players 1, 2, and 3 in a coalition, see who is critical. If we were to think about player one is critical barely because 9 and 5 would come up one short of the quota. So, if I'm thinking about this group, they really need that player one in their group. If they don't have them, it's going to change. But if we're looking at, say, player two, notice that player two is not critical here because 13 and 5 can win without them. So if player two changes their mind, the players 1 and 3 are not going to really be too worried about it because they're still going to make that quota. So player two is not critical. And another general principle is that if one player is not critical, anyone with smaller amounts of votes in that coalition will also not be critical in the same reason. But you can still check that one. That one will also be short. Sorry, it will not be short, right? If 5 is removed, they 13 and 9 would have plenty of votes without him to make the quota. So in this case, only the first player is critical and the others are not. But it can be any really combination. It could be all three critical, two critical, one critical, even no critical. So it just depends on the situation, which is why you need to be careful. This video is getting long, so I'll go ahead and end this one here. And in the next one, we'll actually run through the complete Banzhaf power distribution.